Welcome to the Gyaff, Joel Earl Simpson. Nice to have you.
Thanks,
How
Alex.
you
Thanks
doing,
for having
man?
me. I'm all right, except for a broken bone in my forearm.
Yes. You asked we address that out of the way,
No, let me
and
get it out of the way
yeah,
because,
so
like, people see your clips on
right,
social media and what's like, what's happened to him?
right. So you
So,
broke your arm because you're basically single-handedly holding up the LGBTQ community.
far from that, a couple weeks ago, I went playing paintball for the first time. I've always wanted to do it, and I went with some friends from my gym. It was like a birthday celebration for two people, and we thought like, oh yeah, this is a good kind of like excursion activity for a gym crew. And I was winning one of the matches. Like, I don't know if you know paintball is I always do this
Yeah.
capture the flag thing. So I was running downhill with the flag in one hand, the paintball gun in the other hand, and near the bottom of the hill, I like tripped over a tree stump or something, and my left arm basically broke my fall, so my entire body fell on my left arm,
God.
particularly the forearm. I thought I just twisted my wrist or something like that, and fortunately for us, one of the guys that was playing on another team was like a medic in the army. And, he kind of do some kind of bush thing where, you get a piece of board
Yeah.
and some
Splint
cloth
it.
and wrap it
Yeah.
wrong and so on. We had a temporary fix. And then I even went to like Temeri Medical Center to get a better wrap. And then late in the evening, kind of came down and went to the hospital. And when I got the x-ray, it's like, no, it isn't just like you didn't just twist your ankle, your wrist or anything like that. You broke a bone in your forearm. So
No
I have this
way.
broken bone here.
Did
My-
it progressively hurt as like it kind of the adrenaline stopped going?
Yeah, it did. On the day itself, it did.
Yeah.
It did. So that was pretty interesting. So that's why they kind of like wrapped it and they used a board to kind of keep it flat. And then when I got to the hospital, they kind of they manually kind of like aligned it because it was clean. It's a clean break.
Yeah.
It's like it's the longest bone between the wrist and the elbow.
Oh, yeah.
And they cast it, and I'm gonna have only way to permanently fix it. This is just a temporary fix. This is a temporary hold. I'm gonna have surgery in a couple of weeks to kind of like
No,
tack the bone
that's
back
probably
together.
the best thing to do. But yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
But I'm happy, you're doing better and you made it.
Yeah.
Work never stops, I guess. Not that this is work, but I just mean, you just
Yeah. I
our
mean,
work never stops in whatever we're doing.
yeah, it's kind of like life has to go on. So it's you know what? I feel like if like the universe is sending me a message in some ways, I'm always like looking at what's the deeper meaning and what does this mean and so on. And I feel like this year I need to think about disability justice a lot more than I normally do because for some people they don't have a limb or they can't walk.
Sure,
And
yeah.
for me it's a temporary situation, but for some people that's a permanent way of life. So
Yeah. Well, strangely enough, you said that I just did a podcast yesterday with a girl named Yana Edgel, who's a physiotherapist. Great person. And she works a lot with, does physiotherapy, but she's attached with public sector. So there are a lot of resources actually for like kids and stuff. Well, not a lot, but there are resources for kids with like cerebral palsy and like who don't have certain limbs, and so she works with a lot of handicapped people like that. And we were just talking about how the lack of resources in just society that there are for those people just to make their lives easier. I mean, it's hard enough for like normal people,
Yeah.
but,
yeah.
it's something we do have to think about. And
Yeah.
it's interesting.
I do try to think about it a little bit in my work. Like, if we're going to have a workshop or something, I always try to say, okay, let's pick a venue with a ground floor, especially if we don't know who's coming.
Yeah.
So there's access. But in our country, generally, we don't think about that enough and make accommodations and provisions for people with all kinds of disabilities. So
Yeah.
it's not just physical, it could be sight and hearing and
Sure.
yeah, it often feels like an afterthought in Guyana, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think that's the deeper meaning and that's the message that the
Yeah.
universe is sending me. So
So this is your opportunity to connect with that demographic.
yeah, because I think you don't really have single issue struggles. That's something that Audre Lorde said in her writings, and that everything is all connected in social justice, right? You
Yeah.
know, so
How'd you get into social justice? I mean, I know we're gonna talk about all this stuff.
Yeah.
But you are the head of. What's your position in SASOD?
So I'm the managing director at SASOD Guyana.
Managing director at SASOD.
Yeah.
Did you found SASOD?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Like, how did that start? And
So it wasn't, the intention wasn't to start an NGO. So when I studied law at the University of Guyana.
nice. Where'd you go to school before?
I went to Queen's College. I went to St. Margaret's Starters Nursery.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, directly out of high school, QC Sixth Form, I did the LLB at UG. And we had a lecturer from India who taught us jurisprudence. And we had to deal with a lot of social issues, abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality. So these conversations came up. But not only was he a law lecturer, he was very involved in writing letters in the papers in Guyana. This is 20 years ago.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just about to ask you
20
what
plus
year
years
this
ago.
was.
This is
Yeah.
2003. So we actually launched on June 7, 2003, which is about 20 and a half years ago.
Just to interject quickly, what was the sort of attitude towards those kind of issues in 2003?
Well, first of all, a lot of people weren't talking about them. This was driven by a parliamentary process. Our advent and our entry into this conversation was driven by a parliamentary process. So after the 1997 elections in Guyana, with all of the conflict and riots and all of that, there was this Herdmanston Accord, they called it, and a huge part of that to quell that, CARICOM kind of brokered that between the PPP and the PNC, was that there would be this constitution reform process. So there was a 1999 Constitution Reform Commission. By 2001, there were actually bills that were tabled and passed unanimously in the National Assembly. And one of them amended the non-discrimination clause in the Constitution to have more grounds, because ours was really limited before 2001, 2003. And, the idea was to expand and add a number of grounds. And it was really inspired by the South African post-apartheid constitution.
Okay.
And sexual orientation was one of the grounds. So it actually, this bill actually passed Parliament unanimously in 2001. And when it got reported in the press that, hey, this bill passed, and among some of the new grounds for discrimination in the Constitution are things like marital status, religious vilification, sexual orientation, and in particularly sections of the religious community kind of zeroed in on that, and they were opposed to all three. And then after a while, they just kind of or the ones that were really opposed to sexual orientation just kind of kept on that one. Yeah. And it was particularly sections of like the evangelical Christian community and Muslim communities.
Yeah, not surprising.
And they opposed the bill, although it was passed unanimously. And this was also a period where, there was a lot of political changes. Anyhow, the long and short of all of that is that then President Jagdeo, by then he was president, he sent it back to Parliament to be reconsidered, which is a procedure that is
specifically
possible.
The sexual orientation.
No, the whole bill, because it was part of everything.
Gotcha.
Right? So this is 2001. So then it actually came up back in 2003. It was the reconsideration, and by then I was a second-year law student at university. And, my lecture was like writing letters in the papers and organizing fora. So I went to this fora on sexual orientation that he organized with some of his friends and colleagues, and I kind of spoke during the Q&A. And I met a lot of people who wanted to advocate around these issues, Vidyarthi Kisoon being one of them. And we got together after and came up with a number of strategies. And one of the strategies that we discussed was that what was missing from the entire national debate at the time was the voices of young people.
Yeah.
And for a long time, Guyana's been a country with a very young population. That didn't just happen overnight. So I said, you know what? I have a bunch of friends, mostly at UG, young people, who share similar views. Why don't we get a student lobby group? Why we just don't form a student lobby group to advocate for this issue? And just in conversations like that, we were having, and we said, yeah, and then we started coming up with a name. I'm like, yeah, I mobilized like 15, 20 people who were willing across, not just studying law, people were studying medicine, biology, like just, people that you knew that had progressive views across campus. And we had like 15, 20 people. And
Mostly men or women, mostly men and women, or
it was mixed.
mixed?
It was
Okay.
mixed. And these are just university students, as far as I know, and I still know a lot of these people today.
Yeah.
The majority of those people were heterosexual, identified as heterosexual. So
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
yeah. You would just assume that, it's going to be a bunch of LGBTQ students from UG. No, it was.
Yeah.
We were actually the minority. And we said, yeah, and we came up with a name. It was Students Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination. So that's where SASOD came from. The S was students. It's only like 2005 we changed students to society. And now we kind of just use SASOD as a name. And we don't really use the long title anymore. Because we find it kind of limiting.
Sure.
And we started, what we did on June 7th in 2003 is that we wrote to all members of parliament, all 65 members. We actually had letters signed by 15 people because the group then didn't have a hierarchy. So there was no chair or anybody to sign. It was all 15 of us going to sign these letters to these parliamentarians. So we did. It was 2-3 page letter inviting them to a forum at the National Library's conference room on Saturday, June 7, 2003. To discuss this issue of sexual orientation in the Constitution. Nobody from the government and PPP civic side came, and we only had 3 opposition MPs. Now, in our minds, this was a forum specifically targeted parliamentarians, so we didn't invite a lot of people outside of Parliament. We did invite a few civil society people that we were working with at the time and allies and so on, but that didn't work out, especially since the government side didn't show up. And 3 came from the opposition. I remember the names. Vincent Alexander, who at the time as well was the registrar at the University of Guyana. Laureline Nestor, she was a member of parliament for the PNC for the time. And she was also studying law with us at UG. I think she was the year ahead of me, if I remember correctly. And a parliamentarian by the name of Myrna Peterkin also came. So we had just had these 3 parliamentarians. Capital News was the popular newscast back in the day, so I could always remember the news on the following Monday, because I feel like if they were Capital News and Starbuck News are the main local news agencies, I remember covering the launch event.
Yeah.
And I remember the following Monday, Gordon Mosley used to anchor the news for Capital News back then. He said, let's tell you that over the weekend, some students from the University of Guyana were at the National Library talking about sexual orientation. And that was the lead up to that. So that's how it all started. And we lobbied. At this point, June, we probably had just written exams at the end of May or thereabouts, if I remember how the second semester runs from some point in January for 15 weeks. And we said, okay, by the time school starts back in September for our final year, we're going to be done with this. We're going to lobby, get this law passed, and go back to school, The naivety of youth.
Little did you know, yeah.
Yes, the
That's
naivety
works,
of
man.
youth.
That's how it is.
This is a holiday project,
That's a real young people approach. Yeah.
Of course, we know it didn't work because what happened is the government did something that is completely unprecedented. So they had the clear majority in Parliament. And these days, Parliament used to meet at, I remember it was at Ocean View International Hotel because they were renovating public buildings, like how they're meeting at Arthur Chung now, similarly. And they had a complete majority, and they brought this, what they did. Remember I told you it was a bill with a number of constitutional amendments, adding more grounds to the non-discrimination clause and all of that. They separate the sexual orientation provision into a bill by itself. And they put everything else that had passed in 2001 in another bill. So now this bill that is trying to amend the non-discrimination clause to include sexual orientation is isolated.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it's the controversial issue.
Yeah. And
it gets dubbed the sexual orientation bill. So it's already stigmatized now. And then they presented it in Parliament and said, although we're presenting this, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, although we're presenting this bill, we have no intention of supporting it.
They
And
said that.
yeah, so it's like the most awkward thing. And both sides of the house did something like they had one or two persons speak for and against the issue. So there was a kind of a balance. Yes, I'm in support, but there's this kind of story like, yes, I'm in support, but we need to do more public education so that the country understands the issue.
Just
and
to
all that.
interject quickly, I was reading in Parliament website the other day, before I had Sherrod Duncan on the podcast, and I was reading an excerpt of it being talked about in Parliament. I think it was Volda Lawrence presenting the issue. And basically, she wasn't against it per se, but she just said that, in her presentation, it just spoke about the fact that, again, with the religious institutions not looking at it in the best light, and then, these other questions of morale in society, these backward things. Anyway, her point was just basically that it should go to a referendum.
Oh God! Don't tell me that. No, don't tell me they said that
Yeah.
again.
But
That is
I can't remember
an
what year
excuse.
that was.
Yeah, I think I've heard that a couple of times from different kinds of political actors. So this is a storm in a teacup issue, and one of the things that I mentioned to you before is that we've done polling to see where public opinion is on this issue, and the most recent polling that we did was in 2022. The first ever polling we commissioned was 2013. And then we did it 9 years later. We are at a place now where the country, the majority of people are in support of legislative reform for LGBTIQ people. For instance, when it comes to, we didn't ask about constitutional reform specifically.
Yeah. Before we get into that, Joel, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
Back then in 2003, when these events were happening, what do you think was the factor blocking a bill like this being passed? Is it something as simple as, oh well, if we pass something what in their opinion outrageous at the time, that there's a loss of votes, or do we just lose the religious communities and therefore funding?
Yeah. So
what is that about?
I think it's a multiple factors, but I'll tell you what some of it is. And I think we've provided resources to address a lot of it in the last 20 years, right? So we had some time to work on these issues. One of the things that was a major issue back then, people were saying like, what discrimination against LGBTIQ people? Where are the LGBTIQ people talking and lobbying for discrimination? Now, as strange as it might seem, when we first started SASOD, and even for many of us who were identified as LGBTIQ people, we did public advocacy, especially me. We never spoke in the first person, so we weren't out publicly. It was actually some years ago, it was like 2013 or so, I did my first out media interview as a gay man on TVG, a morning show that was produced by my good friend Ashley John. But and I kind of came out on social media like a few years before that. But a lot of the time, in 2003, we were speaking into third person, those LGBTIQ people, and so on and so on.
It really takes away all the ownership.
Well, I don't think that was it. I think there was the voice of the community was missing, and we didn't have evidence of discrimination.
Okay.
So that was a huge part of it that we fixed. We have done extensive research over the years, documenting discrimination against LGBTIQ people, violence, and all of that, and so on, bringing it to the media. So now that nobody can say violence and discrimination against LGBTIQ people doesn't happen in Guyana, right?
Okay,
There was a certain kind of denial about it because it was quite invisible. I think also there was a perception that these very vocal but minority religious leaders who don't represent the majority of the people and the people's views, that they were speaking on behalf of a large constituency behind them that was opposed. That was the real perception, and that's where polling 2013 and 2022 shows is very different. And what we recognize is that religious institutions are very kind of hierarchical, and even if your father, pastor, reverend, imam is saying something on the pulpit in front of the church or mosque or temple that you don't agree with, you sit there and listen. But you don't get up and say, hey, I disagree. You know, as a Catholic, the official position might be don't use condoms or whatever. But you're like, no, it's a family planning method. I'm not paying any attention to you and whatever Catholic policy is on condoms.
Yeah.
I'm going to be using condoms.
Just let it slide.
Yeah, you're going to just like, yeah. And we are generally like, we're a conflict averse population generally, except when it comes to like politics and elections. That kind of raises us up. But we're generally, you know, so you let your leaders just like say whatever and you just kind of like suck to yourself. Like, I don't disagree with that, but I'm not going to argue with you, right? So we found that these views that these religious leaders who are very, very vocal and opposed have are really minority views. But 20 years ago, they were the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
They were the dominant narrative because we didn't have polling data to show that the ordinary person doesn't necessarily agree. We didn't have enough people who are coming out and speaking out and say, hey, as the Catholic Church, as the Anglican Church, as the Presbyterian Church, we have different views. And we don't necessarily agree with what you're saying as an evangelical denomination or as a Pentecostal denomination, right? So all of that kind of presented to a perception that political parties could lose votes if they support this issue, but it's really a storm in a teacup issue. Nobody will lose any votes from passing progressive legislation on LGBTIQ issues. In fact, they're probably minority votes to gain.
That's what I think. I told this to Sherrod the other day. I was like, don't you think like there are votes to gain from young progressives who are, you know, who are not really political in nature, but like they are behind progressive, you know, issues. Like,
yeah,
so
people don't want to.
I feel like you have everything to gain.
Yeah, that's the reality, and the data is there to show it now. The polling data is there to show it now, but you know, people generally don't like to rock the boat. People generally don't like to rock the boat. If we could just kind of like ignore this issue and just kind of keep kicking the can down the road, this whole thing about, oh, we need to educate the population, and we need to sensitize the religious leaders and all of that and so on, it's literally kicking the can down the road, because guess what? There's been a lot of work done to do that, and it's yielded great results.
Yeah.
But let me tell you something. There's always going to be a small number of people, and it's taken me a long time to realize this, that you're never going to convince. You're never going to win over. There's always going to be a few bigots in any society who are going to be homophobic, racist, sexist, misogynistic, right? And no matter what you say, they will remain that way in your lifetime. They will say things, well, oh, I have gay friends, you know, but it's always some kind of cop-out, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to win everybody over. And if the expectation on the side of the political leadership is that you need to convince everybody, that's completely unrealistic.
Oh yeah, for sure. But that's just a convenient thing to do because they'll never measure it either.
Yeah.
Interesting. Going back to when that bill was put into that was put into a separate bill and then eventually denied. They somewhere along the line settled on it, which was such a farce in my opinion. They settled by just getting rid of the cross-dressing rule or something like that.
Right. Well, that's a whole other story.
Was that their sort of compromise?
No, one thing had nothing to do with the other.
Okay.
So even for us, we were always very aware that there were laws criminalizing same-sex intimacy.
Right.
Laws criminalizing intimacy between men on the books.
Not women.
Not women, specifically to men. It's gross indecency is the short title of one. Buggery, attempted buggeries. It's like Article 351 to 353 of the Criminal Law Offences Act. We were always very aware of that. But by 2006, when somebody actually got arrested for cross-dressing and it was reported in the Starbuck News, I remember it was like mid-May of 2006, and the late Petronella Trotman was her name. And we were like, whoa, You know, the Star Commission was saying that somebody got arrested for and fined for cross-dressing, like brought before a magistrate's court, was a single arrest. And we were outraged as a young SASOD. We would have been almost 3 years old at this point. And we did a lot of media advocacy that we could have done at the time. Back then, radio was an important media space for us. And I remember us going on NCN radio with Stan Gavaya on a late night program and taking Petronella on. And it was a calling program as well. Was it Stan or was it Narissa Pearson? But it's one of those kind of like broadcasters who've been around for a while. And the sentiment from even the people calling in, even if people disagreed with cross-dressing, the sentiment was, yeah, we shouldn't waste law enforcement resources on policing how people dress. This is absolute nonsense. There's like real crime happening in Guyana, and the police is arresting people for wearing a dress. Or a skirt. This is absolutely insane. Are you going to arrest everybody on a stage play at the cultural center as well?
Yeah.
And, you know, so there was this overwhelming sentiment. And we're like, good. Finally, an issue where there's like strong public opinion on our side. It wasn't like we support cross-dressing. It was like, but yeah, police shouldn't waste time and resources behind this. And
is that the right, sorry to cut you. I'm just very interested in these issues. Is that the right approach to the cross-dressing issue, or was it just more of like to start the ball rolling?
Yeah, you kind of want to have to work with what you have.
Yeah.
Because you don't want criminalization.
Because I think it's so ironic that, but I mean, like to argue it, why are police resources being wasted as opposed to just being a right for people to just dress however the hell they want?
So we didn't necessarily had like an overwhelming majority thinking that there was a right. That's not true.
And I also find it ironic that, you know, in that same vein, like you said, Link Show and all these things will exhaust this idea of cross-dressing and how hilarious it is.
Yeah, and we still do that right now on social media.
And it's so tired,
that.
right?
Yeah.
But like, but then the law is still would have still been in place at the time that it's illegal. It's crazy.
Yeah, but for us, what we wanted to see, particularly for our trans constituents, is that they were safe to occupy public space,
right,
and express their gender.
Gotcha.
You know, at that point, that's at the very least what we wanted to see, because we were developing a comprehensive strategy to get both the laws, all the laws which criminalized cross-dressing, same-sex intimacy, and so on and off the books. But fast forward to 2009. You remember in May 2006, there was a single arrest, right?
Yeah.
In February of 2009, early February, there was a crackdown over a 48-hour period where at least 7 persons were arrested. You know, some got arrested one night, then some another night. And it was crazy because it was over a weekend. And, you know, if you get arrested on Friday night, they could keep you in detention all weekend because, the next court date is Monday. And we kind of woke up to, like, newspaper headlines, 2-3 daily newspapers showing a bunch of people were arrested for cross-dressing and passed through the courts. Most of them pleaded guilty, and they had all of the horrible shots, you know, because you could imagine people have been in jail for 2-3 nights, and they take all of these shots of them fresh out of detention, and it's smuggled all over the papers, and it was horrible.
This was a campaign to lock them up?
There was a campaign. And, you know, some of the outrageous things, like then Melissa Robertson was the Chief Justice. She was quoted in the press as saying that you are not men, you're women. You should give your lives over to Jesus Christ. It was ridiculous. Like, a magistrate is there preaching from the bench. Mm-hmm. So we're like, no, this is not going to go away with just media advocacy.
Yeah.
So we organized the trans community. We documented all of those human rights violations. I remember going around to like Charlestown and those areas where people lived and sat and did extensive interviews on audio recorders back in the day, and, you know, wrote up all kinds of witness statements and so on. We mobilized local attorneys who were interested in human rights. We worked with academics, legal academics at the University of West Indies, Dr. Arif Bulkan, who's Guyanese.
Yep, he's my uncle.
Yeah, Tracy Robinson, who's Jamaican. They formed In 2009, they had just formed something that was called the University of the West Indies Faculty of Law Rights Advocacy Project, URAP, to kind of work on these issues in terms of providing support for strategic litigation in the region, in the Caribbean region around these issues. And we work with them. And we're like, I remember we exchanged emails like, is there something we could do like legally around this? She's like, I want to bring a constitutional suit because you guys have a strong case. We're like, oh yeah, definitely. It took us a year to get organized in terms of the paperwork and so on. So exactly a year later, in February 2010, we filed. And we brought a constitutional suit challenging those laws. We had mixed results, I would say, before we got to the final decision. We went through all levels of court in Guyana. At the first level, the late Ian Chang, who was then Chief Justice, the Chief Justice always sits as the Constitutional Court in Guyana. Ian Chang said, cross-dressing is not a crime unless it's for an improper purpose.
Like solicitation?
So that's it. He never said what an improper purpose meant, but we felt like that was part of the subtext, but he didn't say it. And it also made sense legally why he didn't say it, because technically and legally, sex work isn't illegal in Guyana. It's actually offenses related to sex work, like soliciting in public, not just soliciting, right? You'd have to be solicited in public. Living off the earnings of prostitution, as the term is used in the law, is an offense. Running a brothel, well, they don't say brothel, they say a brothy house. You know, all these kind of old English terms from 19th century legislation, right? So the thinking with our laws is that they try to criminalize the pimps and not, at the time, the women who were involved in prostitution, right? Because they saw it more as an economic issue. And if you criminalize these pimps who are forcing these women into prostitution against their will, that's how you'd get to who the real authors of this issue, of this issue is. So he didn't say it. So we're like, okay, this is kind of like giving us a victory with one hand and then taking it away with the other. So we're like, okay, it's a start. At least he said it's not a crime. But if you don't say clearly what an improper purpose is or it isn't, the police can still arrest people. Because we think, okay.
There's no lines then.
Like your short two skirt, that's an improper purpose. Your wig is too much of a bright color and I don't like it, that's an improper purpose. So we appealed to the Guyana Court of Appeal. By then we were so the first decision came in September 2013. Remember, we filed now in February 2010. This stuff takes years.
Yeah.
I remember the hearing was like June of 2013. And I was actually away in the UK doing my master's as a Chevening scholar. But my colleagues were here on the ground and going to court and all of that and so on. But by the time I got back in September, we had a decision, or it was just on the way back in September 2013. We appealed, and we didn't get a decision until February 2017 from the Court of Appeal. So that's now another, 3+ years later. And I remember the former chancellor was like, this is one of the last decisions he gave just before retiring, Carl Singh. And he basically agreed with everything. The Court of Appeal was 3 judges. They agreed with everything that the lower court said. And they even took away one of the procedural grounds that we won on, because Ian Chang had ruled that the police had violated the rights of the plaintiffs, the cross-dressers, who were plaintiffs in the case because they hadn't read them their rights. You know that don't happen in Guyana. You read your rights when you're arrested. You have a right to remain silent. We only know about that on TV. It already happened in Guyana. So he said, okay, you won on that ground. And, Ian had said, you won on that ground. The Court of Appeal said, well, how do you know? Because you didn't put the police on the stand and do cross-examination and all of that and so on. You just took it as a matter of fact because they didn't oppose it on paper. That was true. So we lost more than we gained at that level of appeal. And then we finally got to the Caribbean Court of Justice. And we actually went to the hearings in Trinidad and Tobago because, it sits in Port of Spain.
Oh, nice.
Pre-pandemic, almost everything was in person. So we went for the hearings. I remember it being like...
What was that like? That at least had to be an empowering moment to just take it that far.
Yeah, it was. It was a big deal. And we had actually colleagues from around the Caribbean who came from as far as Belize to support us and so on. So the courtroom, and we have like photos. The courtroom was just kind of like filled with LGBTIQ, feminists, civil society activists, not just from Guyana alone, but from all around the Caribbean.
This was 2013.
No, this would have been like 2018 now, because
At this time,
June of 2018, yeah.
At this time, was there any sort of government, not backing or public backing, but at least, you know, from the shadows of just like support for the cause? Was there any public sector sort of encouragement?
Well, we've over the years there have been lots of political pronouncements, regardless of who's been in power.
Okay.
Of the 20 plus years that SASOD has been in existence, obviously the PPPC has been in power for most of that. We've only experienced the APNU AFC coalition for 5 of those 20-something years. There's always been political pronouncements, and I feel like we're at a stage where it has to be more than that. At one stage, it was like, yes, it was a good thing to get a minister to come to a function that we were hosting and speak in support of the issues and so on. But we're at a place now that if you're not coming to the table with some kind of tangible action,
if you're not willing to table it,
you're not tabling legislation. It don't even have to be that. Like, you're not tabling legislation. You're not changing any policies at the level of your ministry that you have complete control of. You're not putting any programs in place at the level of your portfolio to address any of the issues. Then what are you really doing?
Yeah.
That rhetoric is meaningless after a while. And so
100%.
we don't chase after rhetoric anymore because we're not seeing it being backed up.
Yeah. It's pointless. It's
Yeah.
just empty words.
I trouble you to
No, absolutely. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks.
This is nice, by the way.
Oh.
Thank you for bringing this.
Glad you like.
Yeah. So they got rid of the cross-dressing law.
We have through the courts.
Yeah.
We did through the courts. I didn't finish where I was in that. So we're in 2018 now. So I remember the hearing was probably like June, and we got a decision in November, mid-November 2018. We won on all 5 grounds that we claimed. Mm-hmm. It took a while. It took, over 8 years. It was 8 going on to 9 years, but we won on all 5 grounds. What happened 2 years later that where you recognize that there was an issue of cross-dressing dealt with in Parliament? When the PPP civic government came back into power in August 2020, what they did a year later in August 2021 is they formally removed the anti-cross-dressing provision from the statute books. Now, I think it was an important symbolic gesture because people could have easily missed the news. It was all over the news in November 2018, but people could have easily missed the news then. And it also shows, I think it helps, it's good for public education.
Yeah.
It also shows respect for the rule of law and court decisions. So I think it was a good thing to do. But we are very clear that the Caribbean Court of Justice had already struck down the law. It was already, they did what the court said in its decision is like, okay, we're declaring this law unconstitutional. And they didn't just leave it there. They said, and we're striking it down.
Yeah.
So they took it off the books in effect, right? Mm-hmm. So that was just a symbolic gesture to kind of remove it.
It was already done.
It was already done. So we don't want the PR machinery to convince people that it was done in Parliament or it was done by any government. It was done by Guyana's highest court, which is the Caribbean Court of Justice.
Just a side note on that, with the PR machine these days, something as insignificant, I don't want to call it insignificant, but something as inconsequential as doing what's already been done can be turned into this whole facade of a victory.
Oh, yeah. So we were very careful. We've
yeah.
never gotten caught up in that. So I don't even think we commented.
Yeah.
Unless asked. Well, unless asked, I would say, it was a good thing to do, but it's a symbolic gesture.
It's also an annoying line to play because at the same time, you can't be bitter about it and then be like, well, this was actually done 2 years ago, and then it feels like a government attack, and into like
the thing to have really done then was to bring a bill removing sections 351 to 353 of the Criminal Law Offences Act, which is a real law that's still on the books that criminalizes intimacy between men. So why didn't they just do that?
Yeah.
Right?
Has any discussion been had or engagement been had with regards to that as of late?
There's lots of discussion happening.
Have you guys engaged anybody recently?
Well, right now we're in a form of engagement.
Okay.
Guyana's coming up for review next month, about mid-March. Between the 11th and the 15th of March is the week before the United Nations Human Rights Committee under a seminal human rights treaty that we've signed on to. It's called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we haven't been reviewed for many years because we haven't submitted reports. We had your reviews every few years, maybe every 3 to 5 years. I don't remember exactly, but we hadn't been reviewed in 3-4 cycles. So, right? So this is reviews coming a long time. And the committee asked questions specifically about that. And the government responded and basically said that it's a controversial issue. It's always a controversial issue. They're working on it. And we put in a report as well, just submitted this week on Monday to the Human Rights Committee saying, well, actually it's not, because we actually have polling data to show that the majority of the population is now in support of this kind of law reform, of removing these laws from the books.
And government is obviously, they have this data.
Of course.
Yeah.
We've launched it publicly. We've been engaging with different stakeholders around it and so on. It's all over.
Yeah.
It's on public internet as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess it's a constant battle. I just feel like we're in a day and age where we're so, look, there'll always be discrimination regardless of if this is made lawful or not,
Yeah.
But I think it's just you have nothing to lose in society. I think people are just also caught up in these Guyanese are also very, they can't move away from what they think is tradition or these old schools of thought. And I think it in certain sections of society that is. But yeah, it's an interesting issue because there's so many people in modern society who are now openly gay.
Yeah.
And don't have that reluctance to come out anymore. I assume within the last 10 years, it must be a lot easier than it was before.
Oh, definitely. And because of the visibility we brought to the issue, we've done short films, we've done a lot of campaigning, television campaigning and so on.
Yeah.
We're working on a new campaign right now where the stories are about resilience and acceptance, and people are coming forward to talk about family acceptance of the workplace among religious communities and so on. We definitely wanted to have more positive stories out there. And that's what we're doing with the Guyana Together campaign. But over the years, the social environment has changed so much that young people and more young people are open and out. I guess you must see it on social media as well. You must see it among your peers and so on, more than existed. And I think that's so important because when we first started doing this work, and even when I was in the so-called closet, the representation of what was lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer was caricature. People had nothing else to point to beside a Miss Lottie character on some paint commercial with the late Andres O'Brien, or a character in some Link Show or one of those National Cultural Center stage plays.
Do you think those things are more harmful than they are good?
I think that they are singular,
Okay.
and you can't have that alone. I mean, before we were willing to go on the media and talk about being queer or gay, as the case might be, or trans, there was Otisha who was willing to do it. I remember as a young boy watching Otisha on Channel 9, on Mark Benchcop and so on. And while it was mostly comedic, and it was intended to be, that was the intention. But even then, there was still representation, right? And there's evolution in every society.
Sure.
We needed to start there, But then we also needed people to come out and talk about the issues in a meaningful way and be taken seriously.
Yeah, you got to move away from the comedy.
Exactly.
You brought
Yeah.
awareness. It's time
So
to get serious.
I would never hit that because we weren't ready in 2003 to go out there and be like, yeah, I'm gay and this is I faced bullying in school. This is the kinds of discrimination I faced in my life. None of us were ready on day one to do that. So kudos to people like Otisha and them who were willing to talk about it, even if it was just in a comedic way, because it gave visibility and it gave representation. So people can say that these people don't even exist in Guyana. There would be a risk of that. But now we have to move beyond that. And we have to, we've gone to a place where people are willing to talk about the discrimination and violence they face. And now we're at a different place where people are also willing to talk about my family accepts me. My pastor accepts me. My manager at work accepts me. I'm out at work. I'm out at temple, mosque, church. And that's an important part of the story because it says that these are no longer as taboo or as controversial issues as the government would like to paint them. These issues have found a lot more public support and social support than we realize or that we're really willing to admit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are the important ones because that means at least you don't have to come out and announce to the world, oh, I'm gay or I'm a lesbian or whatever. But if you can have your inner circle or community make you feel comfortable, you won.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And not to say that, by the way, that we shouldn't push for the laws to happen.
Yeah,
Like that's the end goal, right?
Yeah.
But I think, that's great. I love to hear that. I'm glad to know that's where it is. I mean, I as a straight male I feel like society around me is way more accepting.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't have that same experience, but it's that's good to hear. Do you think the discrimination that happens in today's society, though, they are people who are discriminated against can seek justice, or does the system still, lean towards tradition?
That's why the law reform is important.
Okay.
That's why I was going to say that. The thing about social attitudes is they could get better, they could get worse.
Yeah.
Not necessarily overnight, but it's important that they keep getting better. But like we were saying, there's always going to be a small minority of bigots whose views you'll never change. If any of them commit discrimination, if any of them get violent, or as the case might be and so on, this is why the law reform is so important to us. There must be a recourse to justice. In the Guyanese context, first of all, if anybody experiences a hate crime, our laws have no conception of a hate crime. Hate crime in Guyana is a media term. And this is regardless of sexual orientation. If you've experienced a hate crime on the basis of your disability, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, our laws just have no conception of that. And that's one of the new areas of law reform that we're advocating for, comprehensive hate crime legislation. And we think that's important because unprovoked, you shouldn't attack anybody violently on the basis of any of their human characteristics.
Yeah.
That should warrant greater punishment than an ordinary violent crime. And that concept just does not exist in Guyanese law. If the discrimination is non-violent, let's look at our existing anti-discrimination legislation. Like I said earlier, we didn't get anything in the Constitution that is specific. So we don't have sexual orientation, gender identity there, right? So we can't protect people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. They can't go and bring a constitutional suit if a state agency refuses to provide them with a service that they provide to a cisgender heterosexual Guyanese, right? They can't bring a constitutional suit on that basis. We have specific legislation that is related to discrimination related to work. It's called the Prevention of Discrimination Act 1997. That also, there was no conversation about these issues happening in 1997. So that also doesn't include sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. That's one of the areas that we're asking for that law, ordinary piece of legislation, to be amended. And incidentally, that's the one that has the most public support. That one, in our polling data, over 70% of people, I think it's around 75%, between 72 and 75% of people say, yes, amend the Prevention of Discrimination Act to include these grounds so that LGBTQ people who face discrimination accessing jobs or on the job can have some recourse. They
Yeah.
can bring a suit against their employer, whatever the case is. The problem is you have to, you're forced now to rely on some general area of law that mightn't address your specific situation. So if, so for instance, if an employer fires somebody because they're transgender, there's discrimination on the basis of the gender identity. We now have to look at the case and say, okay, we can't go to court and say this is discrimination on the basis of gender identity, but was it unfair dismissal? And we have to look and see what the contract says. What does the general employment law say? Were they warned? Were they given sufficient notice?
How do you even prove? Yeah, I mean,
All of those things.
How do you prove it's would be based on gender identity? You know, how do you prove that I fired my trans employee because they're trans and not because they're a bad performer?
I guess because people know that the laws don't exist. They don't usually hide it. You know,
Gotcha, yeah.
They say things and so on. Like.
But if it, just to be devil's advocate here,
sure.
if the laws did exist, how would you go about that investigation? I mean, like, how would you?
Yeah, I mean, like, for instance, a lot of people might get a job, but at the time they got the job, they don't reveal to their employers or coworkers that they're gay, queer, bisexual, trans, or whatever. So somebody might then see a picture of them on social media or see them at an event, and it gets back to the workplace, and you know, so then somebody says something patently discriminatory in the office, you know? Guyanese speak and so on. So, like, yeah. And then that's the reason for demotion, unequal pay, or outright just firing somebody.
Yeah.
It's usually quite patently said. We've even seen instances where it's been written. Like,
Really?
yeah, there are employees who feel quite comfortable writing and telling you that you're being fired and so on because their view of morality does not allow them to keep somebody who is LGBTQ within their employ and so on. And then what do you do with that? The laws don't say anything, right? So you gotta kind of dance around and find other kind of legal mechanisms. Well, was it unfair dismissal? Did they give you sufficient notice? Did they warn you? Did they give you an opportunity to correct the behavior and all of that and so on? And sometimes all of that's quite difficult and not always successful. Sometimes you're very, very lucky, Yeah.
That's interesting. And, I'm sure 20 years in SASOD, you've seen you've had a firsthand experience of how, members of the community are discriminated in society. Have you seen a lot of violent crimes against people in the LGBTQ
definitely
community? And where does that even come from?
Yeah. Seen a lot of violence over the years. We've documented murders that are unsolved. And unsolved because you can't even find who the perpetrators are.
Yeah.
But the circumstances around them point to, the fact that these are hate crimes. There's limited capacity in the Guyana police force to even investigate a regular crime.
Don't get me started.
So much as a hate crime when the concept of a hate crime doesn't exist in Guyanese law, right? So, human resource capacity is limited in that regard. Scientific capacity in terms of the forensic science and and all of that and so on is limited, so that becomes very difficult. And they're relatively recent incidents as well. What happened to me in June of 2019 isn't so recent as well. 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I myself that's the only time I've been a victim of a hate crime. In June of 2019, I was at a popular nightclub, popular night spot, with friends, a mixed group of friends of different sexual orientations and gender identities. But definitely it included at least one or two other gay men. And we are just like, having a good time, having drinks, dancing, hanging out. Maybe the gay friend and I are gyrating on each other. Maybe. Probably. And, at one point we feel like somebody's like sprinkling like drink or beer on us. At first you kind of ignore that. And then a sprinkle becomes a splash. And you're like, okay, hey, somebody's throwing something. And when we look up, there's a group of guys across the room looking at us like menacingly, like, all in, something weird, like all in like black hoodies or something like that, like from what I remember. And we go to the management I personally go to the management of that night spot. And the security manager says to me, we don't want a man whining a man in here, in no uncertain terms. So I told my friends, I was like, okay, we're leaving. So I go to another night spot. I think I went to Giffland to meet up with some other friends. I had drinks. And this used to be my routine when I would go out clubbing, partying on weekends back in the day. After all of that, and a lot of people do or used to do this, I don't anymore for obvious reasons. You go down to Auntie at Border Market at 4 or 5 a.m. to get whatever.
Food,
get some food. And I am there at the counter ordering or about to order. And I realize the same group that, threw the beer on us and stuff at Palm Court is there. At this point, I'm alone. I left my friends and I went down there alone. And at the point when I opened my mouth to speak to, either pay or receive my order and so on, I guess when I spoke, they recognized that it was me for whatever reason. And I was ambushed. These it was like maybe 6 guys. The 6 is the number I remember. 6 guys just swarmed on me right in front of Auntie Stan in Border Market, kicking me down, coughing at me, and so on. I was on the ground. Some kind of city constable tried to intervene. They assaulted him too, and then they ran off. Fortunately for me, how were we able to identify the ringleader? Somebody had some kind of footage, cell phone footage. Somebody caught them. You're taking like selfie videos in the club or something like that, and somebody caught it. Caught the ringleader on camera, not necessarily during the assault, and we were able to identify who it is. So that's the first and only time to date, thankfully, that I myself have been the victim of a hate crime. So it's not an academic exercise for me anymore. I definitely know what it feels like. And I went through the whole experience that I've taken clients through at SASOD before myself. Going to the police station and being at the police station at a counter, having dealt with something that is so emotionally damaging, put aside the physical injuries, right? And police are like feet away from you. Where come for? And you have to shout across the desk to tell them, well, I was at a club last night and these guys attacked me. And everybody else in the station is listening. I mean, it was quite an experience. More recently than that, I think this was MASH Romani 2022 or 2023. When did we have parades back? Well, parades started back in 2022 or 2023. There was a big headline in the Starbucks News that at Barbie Smash in New Amsterdam, there was a group of LGBTIQ revelers in a band. And they got to some point in the route in New Amsterdam, and people just started pelting bottles. They were obviously like a group of friends or something within a particular band. They weren't like, it wasn't like a gay band or anything like that. And even if it was, and they dispersed, and I think some reporters managed to talk to them, and they said they weren't going to go to the police station. And I remember media calling me and asking me like, why won't people go to the police station if something like that happens? And it's generally for the same reason. First, let me say that generally in Guyana, there's a lack of trust in the police. And there's actually polling data to show this. The Latin American Public Opinion Poll, LAPOP, conducted by Vanderbilt University. If you look at the data for Guyana, the Guyana Police Force is the most untrusted institution in this entire country.
You don't say.
You're not that surprised. So people generally don't trust the police. Imagine LGBTIQ people now who will face the barriers of homophobia, who will face the barriers of, and there's just so much. Sometimes you encounter police that is willing to be professional, willing to do their job, and you would be right in the station and hear their colleagues teasing them and taunting them for just giving you service, for taking your report. Why are you so interested in a matter? We gotta watch you snickling, snarkling, right in front of you,
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Doesn't surprise me at all. Bro.
Yeah, there's just so many barriers, right?
Yeah.
So people generally think reporting hate crimes, violence, discrimination, all of it is a waste of time. So what we do, we tell people, if you need help going to the police, you want somebody to escort you, call us, come to us. We will go with you. We go with people to the police, to the hospital, and we navigate you through services if you need help. We also say, if you don't want to report it to the police, report it to us so that we have a record of it. And we have a database in which we collect incidents of discrimination and violence and so on. So we could put out some stats on a regular basis, so we could look at and do analysis on a regular basis to say, this is the kind of violence and discrimination that's happening. And we don't only do it for LGBTIQ people. It's a general database for human rights violations because we have a legal aid program as well. And we say, once you've experienced a human rights violation, you could come to us. So a lot of our clientele in that regard tends to be a lot of women who've experienced gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and that sort of thing and so on.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
And I've heard also in the station the similar
exactly
kind of thing. Man, what she do, man? Is we a telly or something like that?
Right. And even attempts of is a small issue, like the police think that sometimes they can be mediators and try to get people to patch up things.
Oh God.
So
it's the worst thing.
That's why I started out by saying that one thing that we've learned over the years that we don't have a single struggle, and that all of these issues are interrelated and they're all intersectional. So while LGBTIQ people might be the primary group of people we serve, it's not the only group of people we serve, and it's not the only issue we need to advocate on and around. Yeah.
Sorry, just to go back to your issue, did you ever get justice for that?
I didn't. And you know why? I just stopped following up after a while.
Yeah. It almost becomes like it's now you have to now put the effort in to make sure that the system is going to fail you anyway.
Yeah, it's not only that, it was a little bit more complicated. The perpetrator was the relative of a prominent character of Guyana's underworld. That's the way I'll put it, because I've said that publicly before in the media. A relative, right?
Sure.
So there was a great deal of impunity involved. Like it took a great deal of lobbying. Like we knew who it was. The person's photo was published in the media. The name was out there. and you still had to like lobby the police, and you were hearing that, I'm as a victim now, afraid to go out anymore. And you're hearing like, The man being at this nightclub the other night, the police ain't really trying to find him. He just like out and about every night of the week where you're like, yeah, I'm not going out anymore because
Yeah.
it's not safe. And after a long haul, the police didn't even find him. He turned himself in with his lawyer, right?
Course, yeah.
And, I said, what? I will just stop calling and going into the police station. And that's all I did. I just stopped calling, stopped going in. They stopped calling me and stopped following up. I've never, quote unquote, went in and said I no longer want to pursue the case or withdraw the report. So
Yeah.
we got huge issues in Guyana. In my particular case, it's because of the impunity surrounding that particular family. Interestingly enough, it would have been maybe about 2 years ago from what I remember. I was out, it was a friend's birthday, and we were out at outside lounge at Movie Town, and somebody came up to me and said, and I didn't recognize it's dark and all that, so on. This person's shorter than me. He started next to me, it's like, hey, you know me, you recognize me? Like, no. It's like, me, you had a little problem a few years ago at Palm Court, but it's like we didn't have a problem, right? Me, you could. Me, you are right now. I'm like, okay. And he's like, I can get your number and call you and talk to you. No, I think I started to say something like, music's kind of loud. I don't think I'm really understanding what you're saying. I could have heard very, very clearly. I was just like stunned and caught off guard that the perpetrators is approaching me to try to kind of...
This was the same guy or
the
one?
same guy.
Oh, same guy.
The
Wow.
ringleader, the
Wow.
one who was published and turned himself in and so on. He was
Wow,
kind of
no
like, trying to make some kind of amends, but like, yeah. I was like, yeah, I ain't really hearing it's loud. He's like, I'll call and get him and talk to you and so on. He never called or anything like that. But to say that violence happens, discrimination happens, and anybody who wants to pretend like it doesn't, or that it's less of an issue than racism or the politically motivated violence that we see, especially around elections time and so on, they're either in denial or they're just outright bigoted and trying to mask it.
Yeah. I'm sorry that happened to you, man.
Yeah.
Like that's like that is terrible. I mean, for that guy could have been closeted and he was just lashing out. Who knows?
It happens to be most of the time.
Yeah.
We were talking about this the other day that, there's a lot, it's published in like psychological journals and so on. So they've done these experiments where the most openly and outwardly homophobic men who are just like homophobic unprovoked, you don't have to say anything, and a gay man or somebody suspected to be gay just has to walk by and they will say something.
Them off.
Yeah.
But Joel, I see that a lot in our society, and it's like telling, and it'll come from the most like all the men who have to prove to the world how manly they are, and it's like they can't. They're so affected by anything remotely, what they deem a suspect,
right?
And then like it just has to go to a level, and then it always somehow gets like sexual, and I don't understand how our society sort of portrays it that way.
Bro, and this is not just me talking. This is proven by peer-reviewed studies.
Yeah.
Most of the times, those guys are closeted, down low, or men who are struggling with their own, challenges related to same-sex identity. They have desires. So I was telling you the experiment that they did, they got those guys and they put gay porn on, and they have ways of measuring whether you're stimulated. Mm-hmm. And most of those guys, there's a statistic. I don't remember it, so I don't want to misquote. There's a statistic, but it's strong. It's definitely over 50%.
Yeah.
Most of those guys respond to gay porn are stimulated by gay porn.
That's crazy.
So when you hear all of that, I'm always very suspicious of anybody who's like overly homophobic.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, yeah, check yourself, bro. Because
Yeah.
you know, Guyanese would say, Guyanese man would say, well, I don't care. It's like more girls for me. Like, yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, more for me. Why bother?
Oh
yeah.
my God.
I put it, PC because it will be recorded, but and Guyanese would say, now me parts going to blows. It said a little bit more graphically than that, but you get the idea.
No, yeah, for sure. For sure. It's definitely, it's just unfortunate that I think also, with social media, and this is something I kind of wanted to talk to you about because my wife and I really go back and forth and get into some real heated debates sometimes about this. We're obviously not a very progressive society relative to like the US, let's say. And, in the US, there's big advocacy to the point where, the people on the right, the more conservative people begin to lash out and say, oh, you guys are pushing this on everybody and blah, blah, blah. How do we reconcile like, the LGBTQ community fitting in with society and the people who are maybe threatened, not feeling it an imposition in a way? Because I think like, obviously you want to advocate, you want to have a voice. Everybody has a voice, but then there's this other side that feels like, oh, well, it's too imposing, or like they just, why do you think they feel so threatened?
Yeah.
And stuff. And that,
yeah,
that kind of
that's been a constant question. Like, it's a question you get all the time. I think, honestly, this whole idea of imposition or things being imposed is bullshit.
Sure.
Let's start there, because people will say, oh, you're throwing it in my face. But as a straight couple, you wear wedding bands, you kiss in public and hold hands and all of that and so on. You don't see your privilege in being able to do that and not feel threatened for your safety, your security, right? So what do you really mean by an imposition? That is just your way of masking your homophobia,
Yeah.
right?
Why do you have to be discreet?
Right. You aren't discreet. Cisgender straight people aren't discreet. Why does anybody else have to be discreet, right? Why are you even bothered by like seeing any of that and so on, right? I think people refuse to accept, this is the deal. In every society, there's going to be a bunch of people who don't conform to the norm, who are not part of the majority. And when it comes to sexuality and gender, as much as we become more visible, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer people will always be a minority group in society. People talk about, oh, the community is growing. We're not growing. More people are becoming comfortable with themselves and coming out. Less of us are hiding. But
Not growing, you're just getting louder.
yeah, getting louder, getting more visible.
Yeah.
And we're also getting more allies, right? So while you might say, oh, they have a parade now and, a pride parade now, and they couldn't have a parade 10 years ago. Well, that's because somebody's brother and sister and mother and father and co-worker is willing to join in a parade. So it's no longer 30 of us, it's 300 of us, because a whole bunch of allies are there to support us, right? So there is no imposition. That's people's own discomfort because they're not comfortable with their own sexuality, or for some other reason they're conservative, at the very least conservative around sexuality and gender. And they have to deal with that. They have to check themselves and say, okay, why is it I could comfortably watch a straight couple kissing on TV, but a gay couple kissing is so offensive to me? Yeah, right? Why is one offensive and one is not, right? And it's because people put being cisgender and heterosexual on a pedestal, and if you don't live up to that ideal, if you fall anything short of that, If you're bisexual, oh, you're just below that. You know,
Yeah,
you're on level
yeah,
2.
yeah.
You're gay. Oh gosh, you're on like both at least. You're on level 3. Oh, God forbid that you should be trans. You know.
A good pivot. So with regards to, can you explain to me, and this is just my ignorance, and I've been trying to do a lot of research on it. Again, another point of contention in my household.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy someone can come educate me. You know, when we talk about transgender, right? What does that mean in terms of identity, and then how do we reconcile identity in terms of pronouns in society? You know, because I know, like, and again, I don't mean to be offensive, but some people maybe get carried away with the idea of this identity thing that they perhaps expect, you know, the more traditional genders to conform to. So when we talk about transgender, is that, can you explain that to me?
Yeah. So
at least
first
in
of
our
all,
society.
Yeah. So, to begin with, among sexual and gender minorities, the T that we talk about, we're right now using like LGBTIQ. That's about 6 letters.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of advocacy for us to add an A to it, but we haven't quite yet in the Guyanese context. A being asexual. But when let's look at the T. When we talk about transgender people, we're talking about gender minorities. It's really their gender that isn't part of the majority genders. So
this is not sex. This is gender.
This
This is
is-
not male, female. This is he.
So this
she.
is psychological.
Gotcha.
So basically, the umbrella terms means that the gender that you identify with, the gender that you feel you are in your head psychologically, doesn't match the sex that you were assigned at birth. So for most of us, including gay men and lesbians, the gender that we were assigned, the sex that we were assigned at birth, we're comfortable with that, even though we might have same-sex attraction. So as a gay man, I'm comfortable being a man. I don't want to change my sex or sex organs in any way or anything like that. But I'm attracted to men, right? A lot of people can live with that.
Yeah.
But for trans people, they honestly feel like, okay, whoa, in my head, I see myself as a woman, but I'm in a man's body. That's honestly how they feel, or vice versa. They are born with female genitalia, but psychologically, psychosocially, they identify with being a man, right? So first of all, it's a clash between that psychosocial feeling or identity and what they're seeing presented as in their physical body. Now, because this is Guyana, people make a whole lot of concessions are at different places. So for instance, I know trans people who say they're trans, but they don't want to dress as the gender that they feel or do any other form of transition because they are afraid that they will lose their jobs. They won't get promotions anymore. They will face violence if they go out into their working class neighborhoods and need to catch a bus and share taxis and all of that and so on.
Reasonable concerns.
Yeah. So some people are like, yeah, I'm trans, but I'm gonna conform for now. And it would be very different if they lived in a place that was safe, right? So this is where cultural context comes in, right? So it gets difficult for people where, for instance, somebody who identifies as a trans woman is presenting as a man, using a name that society considers to be a woman's name. But in front of them, they see in shirt, pants, short hair, like, whoa, but you want me to use she and her, and you're not even dressed like a woman. You're not even taking hormones so that you could grow breasts. At the very least, you could do that in Guyana, right?
Yeah.
You're not doing all of that, but you want me to call you by a woman's name and use she and her pronouns. That person is probably at that place for safety and livelihoods. And I think that's what gets very difficult for people. It's important to ask people how they identify and just simply what pronouns they use, and just out of matter of respect, use the pronouns and the name that they want to use, whether it's their legal name or not. In Guyana, you cannot change any of your national ID documents to the gender that you identify with. We are far from a place where there's legal recognition of gender identity. We're just a couple of years in from having a very awful law which won't even allow you to express your gender through clothes, right? In Guyana, you also can't have a surgery to change your anatomy, right? You can't do that here. You would have to go out of the country and do it, right? Mm-hmm. The most that you could do here is go to an endocrinologist. That's ideally what you should do. A lot of people take these hormones over the counter, which is really dangerous. I don't recommend it. But you should really go to there's a small number of endocrinologists in Guyana, probably less than 5. You should really go to an endocrinologist and take hormones under the supervision of a doctor if you want to, as a trans woman who might have been assigned male at birth, grow breasts, or whatever the case is, or as a trans man who might have been assigned female at birth, get more testosterone to develop more masculine features and that kind of thing and so on, deeper voice, beard, whatever. You should really do that under the supervision of a doctor. But a huge part of it is the cultural limitations. A lot of people are worried, like you said, understandably, about safety, security, livelihoods. People get offended sometimes because they will tell people, this is how I identify, these are my pronouns, and people will make absolutely no effort to be respectful and use them. They just want to deny that trans people exist. Yeah, because how dare you not identify with the sex that you've been assigned at birth? You're God-given.
Or how dare you not conform to my social norms?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
this is where, and again, I will give it to my wife. That's kind of what we concluded. She's like, look, like, because I was always like, ooh, and thank you, by the way, for sharing this. I appreciate your breakdown, but I was always like, because you see the advocates online, and the ones at least I've researched are a little rough around the edges, and they're kind of like, oh, you need to call me this and that, and so I always have my wife, I'm like, why do I need to do this? And she says, look, like, you don't need to do anything, but if you have a conversation with a person and they explain to you why they would like to be called that way, and it's a very civil conversation, you really have no reason to not. Just for the sake of a amicable relationship. It's not that they're forcing you. It's just that's what they prefer. Why would you not just give that? I'm like, that's fair.
I always tell my cisgender straight friends, just put your shoes in their foot, like, for a minute. Like, imagine somebody just refusing to call you Alex or use he, him pronouns.
Yeah.
Despite you telling them very clearly, Alex is my name. I identify as a man. My pronouns are he, him. And just because they don't think that you should be a man and that you should use the name Alex and so on.
Maybe they think I'm a woman because I can't grow a proper beard.
And blatantly doing that with the intention of being disrespectful. There's a lot of trans denialism. I think I just made that term up. I'm not sure.
We'll run with it. It's fine.
There's a lot of that because we in SASOD, we always talk about homophobias. And it's a bit of an academic term, and we put an S in a bracket. And you know why? Because we look at homophobias or queerphobia as an umbrella. And somebody might not be homophobic, but they might be transphobic.
Yeah.
Somebody might not be lesbophobic, but they might be biphobic, right? So you got all of those nuances as well. They got people who accept the L, the G, and the B, but not the T. So a lot of trans people, from your perspective, you're like, oh, why are they getting so worked up and so on? It's because they're so accustomed to people in their families. Like, that's where it starts. Like, as a young trans person coming out to your parents and so on, and you're still living with your parents, and they just kind of refusing to acknowledge that you're not this gender that you say you are, and so on and so on. So a lot of people come to these conversations with that kind of frustration, with that kind of baggage that, I get this at home, I got to deal with this in the workplace and in my social circles and online. It's a lot. It could be a lot.
Yeah, I see that. I guess it's probably the hardest thing for youngsters or even adults is coming out to their family. I think that's the biggest hurdle. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's probably one of the biggest hurdles you go through, regardless of society. Like society will be society, but your family is like,
some people never do.
Yeah.
Some people, so I know a lot of people who said, well, I will be, the people, and that's what society kind of forces us to do as LGBTIQ people. Sometimes you need to put your life in like brackets.
Yeah.
Like some people are out at work, out socially, but they're like, oh, my parents are too old. They will never change their views. I'm never doing that. It would break my mother's heart. My father will get a heart attack and he will die. I'm just never telling them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, people got to negotiate all of this kind of complexity just because of their sexuality and their gender.
Yeah. No, 100%. 100%. My wife my wife and I have a friend who everybody knows that person is gay except that person, because they've not just come to terms and like, it's just the fallout is just too much to even think about.
Yeah.
Because of his or her conservative background.
Family. I could imagine. I could imagine.
It's brutal out there, man.
Yeah, I tell people, I don't think people should come out until they're ready. You owe nobody coming out.
Yeah. 100%.
You owe nobody coming out. Especially if you're comfortable with yourself and you're honest with yourself. The self-acceptance is more important than family acceptance, social acceptance, acceptance in the church, the workplace, whatever.
Yeah.
That self-acceptance is the most important thing. I feel a great deal of empathy for people who are beating themselves up, who are pretending to be so homophobic and lashing out at every LGBTIQ person or suspecting LGBTIQ person that they see in an effort to mask their own same-sex desires. I feel a great deal of empathy for them. I feel empathy for people who are in kind of cover-up relationships.
Oh yeah, is that a big thing?
It's a huge thing in Guyana.
How does? By the way, we ain't finishing this Gyaff till we done. The
Yeah,
bottle of
that's
wine,
fair
right?
enough. Because there's no cover
Yeah,
back,
yeah,
Yeah. I'm the same way. Once a bottle of wine open, it's got finished. Yeah.
How does that work? Because one partner just not know and are in denial, or when you're in a cover-up relationship.
There's several variations of it in Guyana, I think. And I had to say to a colleague just today in one of our kind of work groups that don't make assumptions. They were talking about, I obviously can't call any names, but something came up and the person said, oh, I never knew that this person was supposedly straight until I saw wedding photos. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, how do you know that they aren't at the very least bisexual? His wife knows, she accepts it, or they're a bisexual couple. People have all kinds of different variations of relationships right now going on in Guyana.
Sure.
People don't talk about it openly.
Well, it's no one's business, really.
Well,
Yeah.
It's no one's business, and even if they were to come out and talk about it, they would face so much flack from their professional circles, their social circles, and so on. But people are very comfortable having bisexual marriages, polyamorous relationships, open marriages, open relationships. These things exist in Guyana, and they're happening all the time, but people not talking about it in a very open way. So let's start there. So don't make assumptions, right? I was telling my colleague. But yeah, then the down low thing. It happens from what I've seen because there's a lot more acceptance, tolerance for women being sexually diverse. There's a lot more acceptance for a woman being bisexual or a lesbian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's almost like a sex appeal thing.
yeah, it's a typical fantasy. Oh, she's bisexual. Okay, orgies with my girls. You know, right? So there's a bit of that. So you tend to see this happening, particularly with men in relationships and so on. They're covering up, they're hiding and stuff like that and so on. And sometimes the woman just doesn't know. The woman just doesn't know. And sometimes I hear people talking about, oh my God, but everybody knows.
It's harder for her if the guy's gay and she's straight and she doesn't know.
Because of society.
Yeah.
Because of, a huge part of what's behind homophobia is our narrow, oftentimes toxic views about masculinity and conforming to certain kind of masculine standards. Even as a gay man, when you come out and so on, so one of the first things people always want to know, like back in the day, the question used to get, at least they're getting a little bit more educated now. One of the first questions you used to get back in the day was, so who's the man and who's the woman? Right now we get who's the top and who's the bottom. Does it matter?
Yeah.
There's also something called versatility as well. Like it could be both. Like why does it even matter? Right?
Yeah.
And that's because...
It's almost like, why are you entitled to that information?
Exactly.
Anyway?
But there is this notion that if you are the receptive or the submissive partner, or as a man in these kinds of relationships and so on, you're falling below some kind of masculine standard or ideal, right? At the very least, you should be the top or, the assertive partner, that kind of thing and so on. Yeah. And that's why I think too, that masculine women are far less threatening in the society because masculinity is celebrated. Masculinity is on a pedestal. So a butch lesbian, that's quite fine.
Yeah, I mean, in society for sure.
Yeah.
I genuinely have my own personal thoughts on butch lesbians. Not discriminatory. I just mean like they're very forward, and to me, like they're threatened because it's almost like a competition.
They are.
Which
quite often,
is my
often mimic
whatever.
masculine men.
Yeah. I feel like they're just very nothing in a bad way. Just I just feel like they're like ready to go. Like just like compete and like to me it's just a pin-up I have. Whatever. It's just stupid.
Yeah, but I mean it's because. What's the representation of, the ideal masculinity in our society is aggression. What's the alpha male? What's the alpha male in Guyana society? He's aggressive, he's forward, he's direct. He gets in your face and that kind of thing, Yeah. So if a butch lesbian is trying to be masculine, that's what she's going to, that's what she's going to mirror. That's what she's going to do. So I was saying all of that. I was talking about the DL phenomenon. The DL phenomenon, so very oftentimes, some women don't know. And,
is that unfair? Sorry to cut you. Is that unfair to the woman?
Oh, of course it's unfair. It's unfair. It's dishonest, especially if, and there's degrees to this thing, right? Especially if you're not just fighting internal feelings, but you're actually cheating on your partner or wife or spouse or whatever the case might be and hooking up with men while you're in these relationships. You're being unfaithful and, it's especially unfair. It's one thing if you're fighting these feelings and you're just not sharing that this is a struggle, but you're not doing anything. But when you actually...
When you're using somebody else.
Yeah, and you're using them to cover up and you're actually doing it. You actually have... male partners that you hook up with on a regular basis and all of that and so on. That is unfair, it's dishonest, it's wrong. Then there's another scenario. So, what I was saying, the point I was going to make was that people always say, oh, but everybody knows. But has anybody told her? Does anybody have, has anybody told her?
That's a good one.
One, does anybody have any real evidence that they could bring to her? Yeah. Right? Because I've heard that kind of conversation, but the whole tongue know, how could she not know? That's just assumptions, right? The other phenomenon is where obviously the writing is on the wall, the signs are clear, but sometimes you can be in denial. Women can be in denial for various reasons, including that they picking slim body.
Yeah.
They picking
I've heard this from a number of heterosexual men and women, just in general in society. Like, why picking slim out here? You know,
Pickings
like
are real slim in Guyana.
I could only imagine what the
I like
community
my
is feeling
straight
like.
girlfriends. I have some straight girlfriends. Like I went to school with and so on. They don't even date locally. Like, yeah, it's like out of the question because they're like, okay, you know, one, I think with our birth rate in Guyana, we are slightly more in percentage terms, slightly more women than men. Then who in jail? Let me take out a number of men because of the incarcerated population, and then you got, you know, who's not already taken, and who are just people that you just can't. Don't
Not
share the same
settled down
values.
type, not settled down type.
Yeah, this man got 10 child mother. What, are you looking to be number 11? No. So they
Lucky
picking
number.
slim. So when somebody sees somebody say, oh, he just go to church, and all of that and so on, he's a God-fearing man. God sent he. This is it.
He loves pink and hygiene, but I can get past that.
I go to say something also very stereotypical, but the society is so small, I don't want anybody to think I'm throwing shade at them.
No.
Yeah, so I don't want to give any examples.
It's okay.
When I was looking down, I was like, Joel, hold back.
It's okay. I'll do that for you.
Yeah, hold back.
I'll take the flack.
Yeah. Don't talk about any particular professions or anything like that, because people are going to think this is shade. But there's also a little bit of that denialism because really and truly, and how we raise people in society, like, especially women, we do an injustice. Like, your life isn't complete until you found a husband, started a family. You could be a neurosurgeon. You could be a scientist. You could be doing so well professionally, contributing to society, improving the world, changing lives, especially for women. It's not, there's a double standard, really, when it comes to gender. Your life is complete until basically you find a man and you drop some children. So there's a lot of social pressure to settle down and find somebody and so on. And not everybody is strong enough to kind of resist that. It depends on how you were brought up, your social conditioning and all of that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's hard out there. And I don't support, as much as it's hard to come out, and I have so many friends who are not all closeted, will probably never come out in our lifetimes. And I'm like, that's fine for you. You accept yourself and you're there quietly in your corner. That's okay. But what you should never do is ruin somebody else's life by being dishonest just to cover up your own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just selfish.
Yeah, it's selfish and it's wrong.
Yeah. In our society, and a lot of the reports you sent me, I thought were very interesting. I know we didn't get to spend much time talking about them, but, in society, and for gay men especially, I guess, is it harder based on the experience you've had for, because of our two dominant ethnicities, Black and Indian, is it harder for the Black community or for the Indian community to sort of come out and with these, express their identity?
Yeah. You know what? It's different. Oh, especially for gay men.
And gay women and lesbians.
Yeah, so here was my perception. And this is how religion influences culture, and culture and society is linked. In Hinduism, there's recognition of a third gender. There's a specific provision in the Bhagavad Gita that talks about, paraphrasing again, man, woman, and whatever, third gender, right? And if you look at some Hindu rituals and ceremonies and so on, you will see people who are assigned the sex of male at birth. Even here in Guyana, you'll see this. People who are assigned the sex of male at birth, dancing, wearing makeup, the way they're dressed and so on, in very feminine presenting ways. So what we found that it's less to do about race than more about if you come from a Hindu background, Muslim background, Christian background.
Okay.
That what we found is generally when it comes to people who've come from maybe a Hindu background, it's easier for people to come out as trans, especially trans women. That's a little bit more accepted. And I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of research this and get it documented very, very clearly. This is now just my own observation of like working in the area over 2 decades. But you see a lot more acceptance for trans women in Hindu communities right here in Guyana. And I think it's linked to that recognition of the third gender in the Bhagavad Gita and the representation that the third gender gets in Hindu ceremonies, rituals, and so on. Yeah. Even in India itself, they're called hijras, and they are celebrated as like spiritual people who have a lot more kind of like spiritual power than the ordinary person. So they play special roles in festivals and all of that and so on. So I think that's where it stems from. So it's more to do with that. Obviously,
not surprising to me. Hinduism has been one of the less contentious religions anyway, you know, like in terms of the
right.
hard
But
lines.
At the same time, I find that when gay men are cisgender, they're both like masculine presenting and so on, it's difficult for them to come out in a Hindu relationship because both of them look like men. Nobody's a woman, so to speak, you know?
Yeah.
Nobody's a trans woman or wants to be a woman. Both of them masculine, and they want... That seems to face a great deal of cultural rejection. In Black communities, I generally find that if something could pass and nobody can really know or nobody could really tell, we could turn a blind eye to it.
What do you mean by that?
So like two guys, masculine presenting, nobody's effeminate and so on.
Oh, gotcha.
Their families might allow one boy to sleep over in the same room, in the same bed, in the 20s. Things that would generally be like raised eyebrows. And that would be perfectly fine because, oh, is he squaddy from the army? God, Joe, stop calling professions and so on.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah. But, you know, that kind of thing. Like, you know?
So like more like eating papa by the seashore vibes.
Oh, you know the film. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So once so in Black communities, you know, that could pass up to an extent because you're still men. You're still masculine presenting. You're living up to the masculine ideals. But don't bring home a trans woman and say you as a man, this is your partner or your friend or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's very, very different. And it's really interesting how...
what's possible and what's not.
Yeah, and it really stems from like religion and the impact of religion and culture and all of that and so on. That's why I've generally found. Of course, there's always some kinds of exceptions and so on. So for instance, particularly in what we found too and not just in Guyana, like Jamaica, I mean, it probably makes sense that if you've grown up in a particular community and people have seen you transition and come into your own, whatever you are, as a gay man, as a trans woman, and you still live there, you will earn some degree of respect and acceptance, far more than if somebody who, just like you, rents an apartment and moves into that community. That other person might face violence or face taunts and teasing walking down the street. But the person that has grown up in that community might not face anything like that because they know that person and they see that person kind of coming into their own. So sometimes...
That's silly logic, though.
It's
I
silly.
hear you, and that makes... I can totally see that. I can totally see that.
Yeah.
Because you accept the village queer, but you don't accept the potential partner that moves into the village.
Exactly.
That doesn't make sense. Yeah, but I totally see it.
Exactly. So, you know what? You just give an example of a case that I'm currently dealing with on the East Coast. This happened like Christmas Eve night. So trans, I would say she's a trans woman. She presents as a trans woman, assigned the sex of male at birth, uses the female pronouns, prefers female pronouns, and goes by a name that society would be considered a woman's name. Lives there, full acceptance. She has a brother that is gay, but doesn't present as a woman. But her partner, she's moved in her partner who is cisgender, masculine presented, and so on, and they attacked him.
Really?
They attacked him violently on Christmas night. On Christmas night. And he's only been living in the community it's been like less than a year. So it goes to the point that I'm making. They would never attack her or her brother because they've lived there all their life, right? But just because and they attacked him, and during the attack, they said, they used pejoratives that I won't repeat on air about that Guyanese use against LGBTIQ people, that you're living with a so-and-so, and that kind of thing and so on. So the attack was based on his sexual orientation. It's a crazy double standard, and a huge part of it has to deal with familiarity. Yeah.
It's interesting. We are a very fickle and many times hypocritical society, I will say. I one of the last questions I want to talk about, because our battery's dying, but in the report you sent me, there was a good, out of your sample group that you get all these the points of view from. There's a lot of people that refuse to answer on certain questions in terms of, like, for example, will changing the laws on the LGBTQ community benefit you or not, or what effect would it have an effect on you or not as a straight person?
I saw that.
And they refuse to answer.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to me, because it's really a yes or no.
Right.
It's not like, and I kind of noticed this trend with Guyanese, where it's like, I rather not say or give my opinion. Well, first of all, it's anonymous,
right.
So nobody's gonna know.
Right.
Which I guess that's a trust thing, which they haven't. But also, it's like, even if it was your name, like, what does it matter if you as a straight person think this about? If you think that the homosexual community in a positive light, what does that matter to society?
Right. So you kind of hinted at it. I think part of it is you might have said that you're a straight person because you're not out, you're not comfortable with yourself. But when you get asked the question about how will it affect you, it hits a little closer to home, because are you really straight if you have some same-sex tendencies or desires that you've never explored? And a lot of times people don't answer questions like that because it's starting to get close to home. Or
What, they feel vulnerable?
partially, but also sometimes you recognize, you talked about it earlier in our Gyaff, you recognize that there's somebody in your family, in your social settings, in your circle, who is obviously queer or gay, but hasn't come out. And, the writing's kind of on the wall where you could understand why. And a question like that gets very, very personal, because you're thinking to yourself, yeah, this would be a good thing because maybe my brother or sister or uncle or aunt or parent might come out, if we change the laws, if we made things better for everybody. But it's an uncomfortable moment, especially with a surveyor that you've never met before coming to your house and standing at your gate and answering these questions, because this is starting to hit close to home. It's not an academic question anymore. It becomes quite personal, and it starts to hit as something that you really haven't interrogated for yourself. And you asking me now forces me to think about it, and I don't want to think about it because it makes me uncomfortable, because I haven't even had this conversation with that person who I'm so close to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And who knows what the repercussions, good or bad, could be. So I'd rather not just say, not say.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's just discomfort, you know? It's just discomfort because now what we do in Guyana, we don't have conversations like this. We don't have conversations about things that make us uncomfortable. We don't have conversations about things that we need to learn more about. We need to like pretend that the topic doesn't exist and shy away from it. So when you get confronted with a question like that, it forces you to address your mind to it. And you've been dodging it mentally, psychologically for all your life. And here there's somebody at my door or my gate, you know, with a tablet or a questionnaire asking me this. And I've been doing everything possible to avoid thinking about this. And you're now here to ask me. Then the easiest thing for me to say is I'd rather not say, because I don't have to think about it to say yes or no. If I choose, I'd rather not say.
Do you think that people who choose that option, which is fair, like we understand that, to me, and I could be wrong, but when by doing that, it's almost, I think in hindsight, there can be some regret there because I had a chance to just, my answer, advocate for someone who I know and care about and whose life would be made more comfortable, or myself if I'm gay or not. If I, and then, it's, so it feels, to me, it feels like wasted because it's like a wasted advocacy vote.
Yeah, you know what? You know what's more important to me than whether they actually answered at that point or not is that when they go back inside and in their own quiet time, we probably asked you about 20, 30 questions around sexuality and gender. I don't remember how many questions were on the survey, but we probably asked you quite a bit of questions. What do you do now that you were forced to address your mind to some of these issues? Are you going to start a conversation with the people in your life that you need to talk about? Is there a gay child or cousin or sibling that you need to say to, hey, I will always have your back. Hey, I accept you for who you are. I will always represent you. I will always defend you. And you're a part of this family, regardless of who you love or who you want to be with. And I think it's more important for them to kind of like reflect in their quiet moments and engage in their own social spaces, their own social settings with people that they care about around these issues than whether they, whether they responded openly to the questionnaire.
Yeah. Well, on that note, cheers, my friend.
I just finished the wine. This is like the last sip.
I just want to say thank you so much for coming. This has been a fantastic conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm so glad you came and made the effort despite the broken arm. That really feels real commitment to the Gyaff. And Joel, I also want to say that I admire the work you do, and I have a lot of friends in the community as well, and they're close to me, and I know the work you're doing is going a long way, and I'm hopeful as we continue to develop, that we're gonna at least make an effort as a society to understand these issues and come to terms with the fact that, there are many people in our society that need the same opportunities that we do, and we should put that, in legislation so that it becomes a human right.
Yeah.
And I'm very appreciative of the efforts that you're doing. So thank you for coming, and hopefully we can, meet again in when it finally does pass, or even before, to discuss.
Yeah, that
more,
would be a celebratory conversation to have. And no, I want to thank you too, because I've been listening to the program. I've been listening to the podcast. I've been following it. And I know that you've asked previous guests to listen to where you asked Sherrod. And I know you'll have other people who are parliamentarians, who are leaders, policymakers in their own sphere. And I think it's important what you do too is that you ask people about this issue so they know that it's important. It's important to everyday people, and that people are interested in seeing acceptance, seeing change, seeing inclusion for LGBTIQ people in our society. I think that's the only way that we are going to get to where we need to go, is that the allies keep kind of bringing this up in all of their spheres of influence. And the Gyaff is an important podcast for that as well. So thank you as well.
Thank you, my brother.
Yeah.
Appreciate you.
All right. Cheers.